Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'll speak in English. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and to be talking to such a young and what seems like enthusiastic audience here. I know that you guys are studying storytelling, so I will try to share a lot of my thoughts about the digital and new media and politics and how they fit into the contemporary picture of the world today, but also try to share some of the personal stories and developments that I myself have undergone, because I think there might be some useful tips, but also stories for you to hear. As you can, or maybe not, hear from my accent, which some people would identify as American, but it's actually more of the Russian kind, if you can judge by my name. I have a Slavic name. I come from Belarus, which is where I was born not so long ago, which is where I grew up and studied. And at some point around 2004, 2005, when I was living abroad, I was living in Bulgaria at the time, I began hearing a lot of stories in the media about this new thing called blogging and blogs and social networks. It was quite some time before all of the platforms that you are probably using. It was quite before Instagram, before Snapchat, before Facebook wasn't really well known back then. And around 2004, the conversation about this media was very different from the one we're having today. Back then, there was this hope and promise that somehow this new platforms, this new media will enable citizens to take control over the media process. There was this hope that somehow we would all be able to participate in the production and generation of news. We would be able to fundraise in ways that go outside of the traditional system, but in regions that had some political problems in the Middle East or in the former Soviet Union, Latin America, there was also some hope that all of these platforms and tools will prove useful on the ground for social movements when it comes to organizing and mobilizing. So from the very beginning, there was this political aspiration that at the very beginning I actually shared, that somehow these new digital platforms and tools would enable us to coordinate the activities of dissidents, of protesters, of people who would like to challenge the status quo in their governments and in their countries, particularly those countries and governments that might have very strong authoritarian leaders. Right? So for me, from the very beginning, there was this very utopian dimension to social and digital media, and I, from the very start, was something of an early cheerleader and somebody who would go and basically be very optimistic and very enthusiastic about the use of those tools. So my first job straight out of college was actually to go and proselytize and kind of advocate and spread the gospel around social media in various countries of the former Soviet Union. I was working for an NGO which was getting some money from various American and European foundations and governments, and it enabled us to go and meet with bloggers, activists, dissidents in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in the former Soviet Union, and to try to talk to them about the utility of this digital media in actually organizing their political struggles. Right? And I've done that work for 3 years. I've traveled very widely in the region. I've got to know a lot that there is to know about blogs and social networks and podcasts and wikis and whatnot. And in those 3 years, I became far more skeptical about the potential of these tools and platforms in helping pro-democracy movements in various parts of the globe. And this skepticism then led me to pick up writing, and I began writing books, I began writing essays, I began writing a lot of critical material that criticized also my own position from just a few years before. And why did the change happen? Well, it happened partly because I went and talked to a lot of people on the ground. I talked to a lot of activists and users who actually telling me that, okay, you come from the West, you come from America, you come from Berlin, where I was living at the time, and you come and you try to tell us that we should be using YouTube or we should be using Facebook to spread the news about human rights violations. But what is happening in our country is that every evening we don't have electricity. So there is no point to be teaching us all of those tools and skills, since we cannot actually take advantage of them. For me, it was a very harsh reality in a lot of those places that revealed the great discrepancy that existed between the expectations about the potential of those media and those tools that we had outside of those regions and their little utility to people on the ground. What I also saw was, of course, the fact that these tools and platforms, even in repressive and dictatorial and authoritarian countries and regimes and societies, were used very much for the same purposes that we use them outside of them. So they were used for entertainment, they were used for sharing funny videos of cats, they were used for watching pornography and communicating with friends. They were not necessarily used for finding and downloading reports about human rights violations of their governments or spreading pictures of police protests. That, of course, was true for a very tiny part of the population, but for the majority of the users, the utility of those tools was limited to mostly entertainment, which in the long term might not have actually contributed anything to any kind of political change in those countries, right? I was actually arguing at some point that the wider use of those tools and platforms might actually lead to some kind of depoliticization, because it becomes easier for a lot of these young people to completely disengage from the political life and become much more focused on the fantastic new world of entertainment that suddenly opened up thanks to YouTube, Facebook, and everything else. But the bigger problem and challenge that I have identified as I dug deeper into this sector was that there was another threat to the future of freedom and democracy and human rights in those regions that we did not really account for, and it was the business models of American technology companies that, on the one hand, there was one group of these companies that were providing all those services, like social networking and blogging and you name it. And there was one problem with them. They were all backed by advertising, which means that, as you very well know from Google, in order to be able to use their services for free without paying anything, they have to monitor everything that you write and everything that you do so that they can then show you advertising. Right? But this advertising-driven business model also makes a lot of these platforms very insecure when it comes to the activities of dissidents. You living in a comfortable city somewhere in Italy might not necessarily care that it's very easy for your police to go and spy on you or to get your data from those platforms because you don't necessarily have something to hide or because maybe you're not afraid of the police. If you live in a repressive society, that of course is not the case, and you are very troubled by the fact that your police can actually go and intercept everything that you do when you're trying to organize. Another problem that I saw in sort of our own backyard in America, but also in Europe, was the fact that there were quite a lot of companies and startups that were springing up in our own countries that were actually more than willing to provide various surveillance and censorship tools and technologies to repressive regimes. I don't know how closely you follow the scandal in this country, in Italy, around this company in Milan called the Hacking Team, which happened in the last, 12 months, that the emails were hacked and a lot of emails relating to the Hacking Team were released. But there you could clearly see how actually an Italian company was more than happy to collaborate with the most repressive regimes in the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, you name it, and develop specific tools for them that will allow them to spy and monitor and basically arrest the dissidents, right? And I was already talking about it in 2008, 2009, and it was obvious to me that it's very hard to reconcile this rhetoric and this rhetorical agenda of internet freedom that was emanating from the Department of State in the United States, from the European Commission, but mostly from a lot of American diplomats and foundations, with what these actual political forces were doing on the ground, right? And I'm not just talking about the tacit approval that they gave to the startups devising surveillance technologies. I'm also talking about all sorts of programs that we later found out from the Snowden revelations that were being undertaken at the National Security Agency in terms of monitoring and spying of domestic and foreign populations in a way, of course, that clearly violated whatever ambitious or expensive notion of internet freedom the American government itself wanted to operate with, but that also clearly showed that there are a lot of activities like cyber war, cybersecurity, cyber attacks that many of our own Western governments are clearly engaged in, right? And it became obvious to me that there is quite a lot of nasty and ugly stuff that's happening in our own backyard with our own governments leading the fore. That looks, first of all, as repressive as anything that you could see in the Middle East or elsewhere, but that also makes it rhetorically impossible to stick to this concept of internet freedom as something that any Western leader could genuinely promote. That just didn't seem possible to me for the sole reason that whatever our own Western governments were doing was actually undermining that very concept of internet freedom. Right, so that just tells you sort of how I got from somebody who grew up in a country like Belarus and then was educated in another country not so far away called Bulgaria, and then ended up entering this field of new media and geopolitics, and eventually writing my first book, The Net Delusion, which tried to understand not just all of the things that I've mentioned from a critical perspective, but also try to highlight one particular trend that then would inform the rest of my work, including the work that I'm doing now and that I'm going to focus on more than anything in the talk today. And it's this growing reliance on technology companies, and mostly American technology companies, when it comes to solving various political problems that face us today. And the problem that I focused on in my first book, and then I expanded into many others in my subsequent work, was this particular problem of promoting democracy. Right? And to build on the analysis I've just given you, it became obvious to me that for various domestic reasons, there were a lot of people in Washington, but also in Brussels, who were extremely interested in harnessing the power of Silicon Valley and the fact that they are ubiquitous, the fact that they are marching into every single country on earth, the fact that they want to build infrastructure everywhere, the fact that they want the whole world to be present on those platforms. There was a lot of desire to harness that power in order to promote democracy, human rights, freedom, whatever lofty rhetoric people in America and elsewhere would like to stick onto that program, right? And it became obvious to me that there were a lot of people tempted by this proposal to actually try to use the fact that Google is everywhere, try to use the fact that Facebook and Twitter are everywhere, to try to get them to be a little bit more helpful when it comes to promoting democracy, right? And that was the first time where I saw how tempting it might be for policymakers to almost completely outsource their policy planning to a group of essentially very young and very arrogant and not particularly erudite tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, right? And I know that some of you may not have caught this and may not remember it, but if you think back to just 6 years ago, you know, the protest in Iran, for example, the so-called Green Revolution, I don't know how many of you remember it, it was actually christened and dubbed as the Twitter revolution by the media, right? Why was it called that way? Because the dominant narrative in Western media, both in the United States and Europe, was that social media was the key, crucial driving force in organizing those protests, right? That was the assumption that now that Twitter is everywhere and Facebook is everywhere, we will have this rebelling young populations taking onto the streets and overthrowing their governments, hence the Twitter revolution. 2 years later, we saw the Arab Spring, which were almost immediately dubbed some kind of a Facebook revolution, precisely again because of that, right? And what I try to analyze in some of my early work was precisely this. It's this constant temptation to sort of rely on these companies and to rely on these platforms as a way of achieving other foreign policy objectives, right? And then sort of if you try to abstract from that into a somewhat broader geopolitical and sociological analysis, you see how easy it will be for America, for example, to twist this as a success story for American capitalism, because if you would listen to American policymakers defending this, they will tell you that basically what happens is that the more of American capitalism you spread around the globe, the more democracy follows. That was kind of the reasoning chain that they put in front of us, that if you would only just let the rest of the world get online on Twitter, Facebook, and Google, we will inevitably arrive at a point where all these young people start demanding more accountability, more democracy, better employment. They would like to join the middle class. They will go out into the streets. They'll start fighting, protesting, overthrowing the governments. Eventually, they will all arrive at nice, liberal, unregulated democracies with the market and capitalism running the show. That was the reasoning chain, which, I mean, I found rather naive and dangerous, and there have been many other fallacies that you can identify in the way in which they reasoned. But this is the logic that I would argue still guides the minds of a lot of our leaders. And troublingly so, not just in America, but increasingly so in Europe, where the assumption now is not only about how these platforms and services can abet authoritarian countries. I mean, forget about that. Now, all the excitement is about how they can actually help us resolve the problems that we have in our own countries, in Western Europe, right? In America itself. And here, you have to understand what has happened with Google and Facebook and Silicon Valley itself in the last 10 years. If you think about how this company started, right? They started with a rather trivial service, right? And that service was you search for something. In the case of Google, Google understands what it is that you search for. They show you an ad, right? That was very simple, very banal, didn't require much creativity. Since then, these companies have advanced and expanded in a way that was almost impossible to predict 15 years ago. And what they have understood is that basically the product they are selling is advertising, right? And in order to sell that product, which is advertising, they have to be able to collect data, right? And basically, the more data they collect about you, the more valuable the advertising they can sell. Because ultimately, all the advertising that they sell to advertisers derives from the knowledge and the facts and the information that they gather about you, right? So at the very beginning, Google knew very little about you. It only knew what you were searching for, right? So based on what you were searching for at the moment, Google could find in real time the advertisers who were interested in selling you products tied to that particular search, right? What has happened since then is that Google has understood that if it can only understand and collect more data about not just your searches, but about virtually everything else you do, it can actually sell advertising which will be of much higher quality, and they can charge much more for it. Which basically means that your entire life becomes up for grabs as long as it can be reduced to some kind of data profile. Right? And you can see how that has gradually progressed from relatively innocent services like email. So what has happened with Gmail, which I guess most of you use? Well, the offer that Google made is that let us run your email and thus also analyze everything that you write, understand everything whom you write for, understand certain patterns about how you travel. How does Google know how you travel? Because when you book an airplane ticket, your email arrives into your inbox, and Google knows that these emails are coming from an airline, so it can build some kind of a profile as to when you travel and how. Right? You can actually, if you think about it harder, you realize that just by having some kind of a basic insight and a basic look into your inbox, you can actually derive a rather rich informational profile of the person. And since then, you know, pushing beyond just your inbox, you can see how the expansion has proceeded into virtually all domains of human existence. Now Google wants to run smart cars, smart thermostats that they already run in your house. They would want to run smart homes. They would want to run smart everything. And now they have rolled out a new type of the Android operating system, which can basically power any smart device. So any smart device can run now on Google, right? Which basically means that you can collect data about anything, right? And they also want to push into health. They want to push into pills that you'll be swallowing, and they will have sensors, and they will be able to analyze what's happening inside your body to tell you, when you might be falling sick or not. And it's not science fiction; it's already happening. They have those divisions. These products are about to hit the market, including smart eye lenses, for example, right? But you can clearly see how this logic of trying to collect and understand you informs what they do and informs this broader expansion and collection of data about what it is that we do and what it is that we are. And Facebook, I wouldn't go into details about what Facebook does, but it's not very unlike Google. It also revolves around collecting different kinds of information, much more focused on your social connections than the rest of your life, but nonetheless, the logic and the principle is the same. As this data is being collected, right, and as its collection involves your interaction with a lot of gadgets and a lot of smart devices and a lot of basically things with screens, it means that this new layer of technology companies become like a reservoir of help to our beleaguered and struggling policymakers who find themselves unable to govern and who find themselves unable to solve problems because they're either out of cash because of the financial crisis, or their hands are tied by various lobbyists and corporations, or they just lack the imagination to get us out of various problems we now face, whether that problem has to do with climate change or obesity or health or crime or terrorism or you name it. Right? And because all these problems keep accumulating and piling up, what happens is that Silicon Valley increasingly presents itself as the provider of these solutions to the governments and to the public. So when you think about something like health, what does happen with health? Well, with health, something like Google makes a very easy to understand pitch. They basically say that, look, because we operate all those sensors in your phone, or also in your car, basically in anything that will have our Android operating system, we can monitor how much physical activity you do on a daily basis. We already measure, those of you who use any activity trackers on your phones or on standalone gadgets, you know that there you can already track how many steps you take. They can easily measure what kind of food you eat. It's very easy to snap a photo, and there are plenty of apps that will tell you how many calories it has, how healthy it is. They can basically measure quite a lot of indicators that basically give some indication about your lifestyle, right? And as your lifestyle can be analyzed, you can also draw various conclusions about how likely you are to develop certain health symptoms. Right? Based on the analysis of your physical activity and the food that you eat, it is actually possible to predict what's the likelihood that 30 years from now you're going to get a stroke or a heart attack. Right? It's not that hard. I mean, there are entire models being built on top of that. Right? So what's happening is that, how did we think about health before? Right? The way in which we thought about health is that, well, in Europe, we had a very strong public healthcare system, which basically allowed us to take risks, right? We didn't think about it as an enterprise for risk-taking, but we didn't feel the daily pressure to think about heart attacks and strokes because we just didn't have to. We knew that there is a well-functioning and mostly free healthcare system that will treat us if we happen to fall sick, right? And we knew that it was always there and we could count on it. What's happening now is that as our societies are aging and as we are running out of cash, for reasons that I'll be more than happy to explore with you in the Q&A session, we are faced with this predicament, which is that we can no longer afford the luxury of not caring about all these issues in the way in which we didn't have to care about them before, but we have to do something about them because at the same time, I mean, these problems may not be that visible in Europe, but if you think about America, it's clear that there is an epidemic of obesity in America. And that's happening not because people are lazy, which is true of some of them, but it's happening because there are giant food companies that are going and striking deals with various high schools and secondary schools to sell rather unhealthy junk food in their cafeterias, right? And you have McDonald's, which has a giant lobbying power, and then they go and set the terms on which kind of the rest of the society eats. It's not a matter of individual choice. So all of those other social processes are happening in the background nonetheless, right? And the danger that we are undergoing now is that we are going to see a shift from the old, rather generous welfare model, under which we actually had the money and we wanted to allow people to have a relatively problem-free existence, under which they knew that there was always some kind of welfare state that would take care of them, to this new existence where ultimately we have to be responsible for ourselves. We have to take responsibility for everything that we do ourselves. We have to always be on the lookout for any potential dangers around us, ourselves. And technology is being sold to us as something that can actually emancipate us from all those troubles. So we actually encouraged to monitor our lifestyle. We're encouraged to monitor what we eat and how much we walk. We're encouraged to become responsible and take responsibility for those things and thus avoid them. Right? And that basically is the promise that companies from Silicon Valley make, not just in health, but also in other industries. You let us monitor everything about your life, and we will make it better. For me, to put it in very simple terms, this offer is actually a displacement and replacement of politics as such, because it basically seeks to replace issues and problems that used to be defined on social and public terms. We used to think about health as something that's not entirely individualistic. And again, as this might not be as sharp to see in Europe, think about, again, America. In America, I can assure you that eating well and eating healthy is not just a matter of individual choice, it's also a matter of social class. Unless you have a car, if you happen to live in California, for example, it will not be very easy for you to actually go and buy healthy food, because you will not be able to drive to a very good food market with organic biological food. It's just out of the question. If you work 5 jobs, which a lot of people have to work because they don't have the money to pay the bills, you will not have the time to cook fantastic quinoa salad at home and spend a lot of time preparing the healthiest meal ever. I mean, those issues are not just issues of individual choice. They are also determined by social and economic conditions, and they're determined by things like class, which, for me, ultimately fill our political life with some content. If you reduce our political life just to a matter of individual choices, and then you start explaining every single problem that exists as a matter of some kind of failings in individual behavior, then you end up basically replacing politics with the marketplace, where the only thing we can do is just to consume better, right? While allowing all the other processes, the corporate takeover of public life, the aggression of lobbyists, the unregulated industries to proceed as they wish. Right? And this is the great danger that I see happen, but I also think that there is a much bigger danger that we'll start internalizing the narratives that Silicon Valley spoon feeds to us, and we'll start taking them as face value and as sort of the fair and honest expression of the problems that actually beset us. And for me, clearly, it's true that if I put a fantastic smart meter or smart thermostat in my house, perhaps I would be able to slightly adjust how much energy I consume and thus help fight global warming. But by any means, that doesn't mean that oil or energy companies do not contribute much more than me, the individual citizen, to pollution or climate change. Right? There are bigger structural forces that are responsible for the problems around us that have to be tackled and restrained without just assuming that we as citizens can take on the burden on resolving the problems because we suddenly have the technology to help us monitor our consumption and whatnot. Right? And this is where I think Silicon Valley tries to smuggle in through the back door a new form of causal reasoning about how problems happen and why they happen. And instead of the old political format and way of explaining the origins of problems, as we try to explain them by locating them in social economic conflict, as we try to explain them in some geopolitical history of repression, oppression, struggle for oil, you name it, we end up with this rather simplistic and almost idiotic narrative where almost every problem around us is the problem of our own individual failings, right? Which also means that the ways in which we seek to correct those problems, it's not just through gadgets and it's not just through monitoring, it's also by influencing your own individual behavior. It's by constantly sending you reminders that, well, today you have walked 200 steps, but you should have walked 2,000, right? Or tomorrow you'll consume that many kilobytes of energy, but you should consume 10 times less, right? And you see that Silicon Valley and the technology companies are more than happy to give you those reminders, and they are more than happy to align themselves with policymakers who themselves are very interested in this psychological dimension of the political life and political existence. Right, so that was one of the kind of aspects that got me thinking about the role that Silicon Valley plays in the political and public life today. And what became obvious to me is that all of these new transformations and changes are possible in part because Silicon Valley has claimed almost uncontested ownership over the data that we generate while using their devices, right? And this, I think, is the paramount issue that has not been addressed by any of the political, social, economic movements that are trying to contest the power of companies today. What has essentially happened with a company like Google, and again, I think it's useful that I have described these activities to you in such detail. What happens is that Google basically tells you, let us collect as much data about you as possible, and we'll give you a fantastic service, right? And the implicit bargain there is that our data is what pays for our use of that service, right? I mean, normally there is no such thing as free lunch, right? I mean, we have to pay for something with something. We can pay for it with taxes, as we have done traditionally in Europe, or we can pay for it with cash when we pay for tickets, or we can pay for it with something else. And in this particular case, we are paying for a lot of the services we receive from these companies without data, right? And the companies then find a way in which to convert that data into advertising and thus make fantastic profits and billions in dollars and euros, which then allows them to do crazy experiments like, mine asteroids or send missions to Mars. And that's sort of where the money eventually ends up. And I think we have to be very careful in assuming that this logical chain of data being the new cash is actually valid or that it benefits us, the customers and consumers, right? I feel that the bargain is not so simple, and I feel that there should be a counter-movement of us actually actively trying to reestablish control over the data that these companies claim as our own. Ultimately, I think that decision that data is theirs and not ours, that decision was never subject to any public scrutiny or any public debate. Nobody has ever asked us, the users and the citizens, whether we would actually like to keep that data for ourselves in order perhaps then to imagine some kinds of alternative futures to Silicon Valley, right? Why should we assume that the only way for citizens to organize a modern transportation system that's based on sensors and algorithms is by relying on Uber, right? There is no reason to believe that that's the only way for technologically modern society to work, right? And of course, some of you might say, well, but Uber is fantastic. And I would challenge that. I mean, it's fantastic in its technological package. It's fantastic in that it does allow you to get a taxi car or a car come pick you up and then drop you off and do it with very little wait time and do it in a very comfortable setting where you don't even have to pay cash. It's automatically deducted from your phone. Technological package is fantastic. There is no doubt about that. What's not fantastic is the economic and political package that surrounds the delivery of that technological one. And on the economic front, the situation is very clear. Uber doesn't employ anybody. Everybody who works for Uber is a precarious worker who cannot enjoy any social benefits. You cannot claim unemployment benefits. You cannot claim anything. There is no social protection, no insurance. You're basically on your own. You don't know whether you'll have work or not. You're on your own. It's just sort of consolidating and consolidating the kind of precarious mode of employment that, in Italy must be well known to a lot of you. Beyond that, it also has very tiny problems, like encouraging this mode of interaction where customers and drivers rank each other. Right? That also happens with Uber. It's not just you ranking your driver, it's also your driver ranking you. So each of us eventually ends up with a reputation which then might help Uber to determine which customer is actually worthy of its attention and which customers are not. What happens to you if your average Uber rating as a customer falls below 4 out of 5 stars? I don't know, maybe you don't get a cab, or maybe you get a cab only after a 10-minute wait. I mean, there is a new mode of power here that clearly has not been thought through. And from the perspective of the provider of the services like Uber, it's obvious that having customers and drivers rank each other is a good thing because in part it allows them to reduce transaction costs. Because ultimately, if drivers' ratings fall below 4, you can just completely get rid of them, which only makes the precariousness even more severe. And the same with customers. If your rating falls below 4 out of 5, they just won't pick you up instead of risking the fact that you will trash their backseat or vomit or whatever. I mean, that's the usual assumption that you're being ranked as 4 and not 5. You must be a potential troublemaker. Right? From the corporate perspective, it makes a lot of sense. From the perspective of organizing transportation within the city, it doesn't. Because these companies do whatever the hell they want, and we do have no control over them. And I just don't think that somehow Uber has stumbled upon an invention, like a time machine that nobody else could have possibly invented. I mean, Uber is worth $50 billion by the latest valuation. That's a company that owns no cars because drivers own them and employs no drivers. Right? An obvious question to ask, where does all this money come from in their valuation? Like, it's a company that doesn't own anything, right? And it's worth $50 billion. Right? I mean, so there is something in Uber's reservoirs that is worth so much. And I don't, by the way, think it's their brand, which is not really that good, with a lot of protests happening in every single European city against Uber. So the reason why I delve into the Uber example so much is that I think it's important for us to understand that the reason why Uber is so valuable and the reason why Uber works is because they were the first company to move in and gather all the data that they could about customers, where they wanted to go, about routes in the city, about cab drivers who wanted to drive for Uber. And with that data now, and with the sensors that are in our phones and thus enable them to know where we want to move, they managed to run it almost like a monopoly. Right? Which makes it very hard for a competing service if, for example, you live in a certain neighborhood in a city and you suddenly realize that, well, you go somewhere every day, you go to work or you go to school, and you realize that there are 10 other people who more or less are pursuing the same route. There was no way for you 10 years ago to know that that's the case unless you would go and physically talk to those 10 people. Now it's much easier to find out because all of our routes are being tracked by our phones. You can actually easily find out that there are 10 people from your neighborhood who are going to the same path or going to the same route but getting off at different points. And if there is no bus service or public transportation service that serves you right now, it would not be so hard to actually organize something now that that knowledge of your shared routes is out there, because it is out there, because that data is collected by your phones. What's missing is a way to take that data and turn it into a service, right? And if that data ends up on the servers of giant American companies like Uber, and right now it does, there would never be a way for us to organize our social activity differently, right? If Uber collects, sort of and hides this data from you, you would never know where your neighbors are actually going unless you talk to them. Right? And this is why I think we have to start thinking much deeper about what's not being done as we rely on this option of 1 or 2 or 3 data monopolists essentially offering the services while the rest of us cannot enjoy what we could have enjoyed otherwise. And you might think that I'm coming here from another planet and talking about science fiction, but if you look at actually many European cities, if you look at Helsinki, so in Finland, they started a service, the city together with the local university, they've started a service that is very much like Uber in at least one sense. They rely on an app in which people in the city can indicate where they want to go. So, on your app, you say, I'm here, I want to go there. And then what happens is that there is a central computer somewhere at the city level, and it has powerful, fantastic algorithms that actually then determine all of the requests, analyze them, and then map out a route for something like a mini bus that then goes and picks up the people and drops them off where they need to be dropped off in a way that's entirely made from scratch on the fly based on the actual demands and needs of the people. Right? So you're moving away from this old model where at 8 o'clock in the morning, bus number 10 will take you from point A to point B, and you have to plan your day around it, to a very different type of new public transportation model where you say, well, I need to travel at 7:25, and I need to go not to point B, but to point C, and I don't want to take a taxi, and I want to go with something that's cheap and travel in a public transportation service, and they will get you there. Right? And they'll get you there with all of the personalized convenience of Uber, but in a way that would not cost you a lot of money, would not lead to any rankings of you or the driver, and will actually involve transportation with other people, so it will be public and cheap in the truest sense of the word, right? But in order for that model to actually develop, pick up, and be used elsewhere, you have to realize that these people have to be able to defeat the likes of Uber and to be able to get the data from our phones. And to be able to do that, you need to start thinking critically about who owns the data, right? Why does our data, what is data about my movements end up with Uber and now becomes a weapon in these negotiations with cities? What's happening right now in many cities in America, for example, is that Uber would go to a city, they recently did it in Boston, they would go to a city and they would say, look, your taxi drivers hate us and they want to ban us. And we, however, have an asset to offer to the city. Since we've been already operating here either legally or illegally, we have collected a lot of data about where people travel, where cabs travel. We know a lot of data about traffic patterns. We know a lot of data about traffic flows, traffic jams, what have you. We'll give that data to Boston as long as you let us operate. Right? It's a very powerful proposition to the city. And a lot of cities actually say, oh, okay, we don't have the data, so we'll take it. And some of them will actually pay money for it, right? So a city would go and pay for the data generated by the citizens of the city, because the city itself has been privatized so completely that our own city administrations are no longer in control of what's actually happening, right? So they have to rely on a private intermediary that then goes and collects our data of the citizens, and then the cities will pay for our own data with our own taxes, so that they can better plan the city. I mean, this is ridiculous if you think about it, but yet this is what's happening. And it's happening only because we never really contested the first basic premise that data is something that should be owned by these companies who operate those platforms and should not be owned by us, the citizens who actually generate it, right? And having outlined that option, I think we also have to be extremely careful not to fall for the other rather tempting path, which is also offered to us by a lot of technological startups in America and Europe. And it's basically to start treating data as something that does belong to us, but it's something that should be treated as a commodity that you can buy and sell in the market, right? And that's another kind of temptation that Silicon Valley gives to us, and it's this idea that fine, if Google and Facebook and Uber get all of your data and they make a lot of money with it, perhaps the solution should be that we ourselves collect all this data and that we make money with it ourselves, right? That's the kind of the market-friendly answer to the dominance of Silicon Valley monopolies. So you have a lot of startups now in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that actually do grant you the offer to completely monitor everything that you do on a 24-hour basis, upload all of that to a secure cloud, and then to let third-party advertisers access that data and then pay you some money for it. right? So, and the idea is that you can actually engage in self-surveillance, upload everything that you know about yourself and that the data that you generate on a daily basis. And since our lives are increasingly lived and surrounded by sensors, a lot of data is being generated. I mean, now you have smart beds and smart mattresses that will tell you, when to wake up and how much you've slept. Even your sleep data is being aggregated. I mean, there is a lot of data out there, right? And the startups will collect all of that, and will also allow you to even upload your basic DNA profile if you have sequenced your DNA. And then they will make money off of it for you. You'll get some share, they'll get some share. You'll be a happy entrepreneur of your data self. I mean, that's the pitch. Right? And I think that this second vision is probably as troubling, if not more troubling, than the first option of just leaving this data with Google and Uber and Facebook, in part because this second vision risks creating a world where we just become extremely paranoid about missing out on potential cash opportunities that we might get if only we collect even more data. Right? It creates this rat race in which there is never a stop. There is never a finishing line as to how much data you can collect about yourself. Right? If you think about it, they do want us to become entrepreneurs who really want to collect everything and who want to make the most possible profit out of the data that we generate. I mean, imagine this. I mean, possibly the manufacturer of your shampoo does want to know what song you're singing in the shower every morning. It's just good for them. They can make a better advertising campaign if they know what emotional reactions people actually have to their products. The manufacturer of your milk would like to know how many seconds it takes you to take out and find out that milk bottle once you open the fridge. But you might think that those are all very trivial facts that have no bearing on reality, but this is precisely the kind of data that corporations want when they build and design their marketing product and market their products. Right? With ubiquitous sensors, it's very easy to create a real-time market for the sales of that and collection of that particular data. So as long as your fridge has a sensor, and as long as your smartphone is somewhere in your bathroom or your bathroom has some kind of smart appliance in it, it's very trivial to set up an instantaneous real-time market in which 10 people will come and bid on that song you're singing and then will actually offer you 20 cents or 2 cents or whatever for knowledge of that fact. Right? It's like that. Our search works like that. Every time you go and search for something and you see ads on the right hand of your search, those ads are generated in the process of an auction. There is a real-time auction to show you those ads. There are people bidding. I mean, you don't see it because it all happens instantaneously and is abetted by robots, but that essentially is what happens. And the point I'm trying to make here, and the point I'm driving towards, is that we risk turning our entire life into this giant financialized auction whereby as long as data is something that we can sell, we will be constantly on the lookout for these opportunities, right? And you might think that this is a very far-off prospect, but there are entire communities now, not just in the US, but also in Europe, that are actually seriously pursuing this option of self-tracking and whatever entrepreneurial opportunities you might see on top emerge. Right? And I mean, I'm not even going into political and social implications of what that means for surveillance, what it means for the ability of the National Security Agency to go and access all that data. Suddenly, just think about it. I mean, now, they're only reading your emails, right? And you might say, well, I don't care, and maybe you don't. But you just think about how much more data will be out there as we move towards this system whereby every single social act, more or less, is being gathered, analyzed, and stored. Because ultimately, once it's stored, legally and technologically, it will be very hard to oppose intrusion into it by whatever spy agency you have in mind. Or think about it, what the collection of all this data will mean for new types of insurance policies that you're likely to see emerge in your own lifetime, if not in the next 5 or 10 years. Basically, we're thinking about new insurance policies that will be so flexible and so personalized that the amount of your insurance contribution that you'll be paying will vary depending on actual particular deeds that you do during the day. So you want to drink a coffee? Fine, drink a coffee. That will increase your insurance contribution by 1 cent. Why? Because it increases the risk of a heart attack. Right? I mean, that's the kind of a new, fully customized, flexible system that revolves around real-time adjustments, whereby all of the institutions that exist around us adapt to this new world in a way that forgets completely values and qualities like solidarity, mutuality, some kind of social belonging, and moves towards a world where basically we are there on our own, financing everything out of self-interest, and we are moving completely away from whatever social model actually existed in Europe before. It's very hard in a world where everything is recorded by a censor for us to justify, unless we actually have the philosophical and political reservoir to think about it, it's very hard for us to justify why we should be subsidizing the activities of our fellow citizens. It's just very hard. Why should I be subsidizing with my taxes the activities of my neighbor who is just leading a very unhealthy lifestyle? He drinks and he eats hamburgers and he doesn't exercise. Why should I be paying the same amount for insurance or taxes he does? Right? Or you can make the same argument about virtually anything, from libraries to theaters to whatever. If you never go to the theater, why should we be subsidizing culture? And in the past, we kind of bypassed those questions because, well, A, we had the money in Europe, now the money is somewhere else, and B, we actually couldn't measure anything. Right? There was no way for us to measure our particular individual contributions to any of those activities. It was impossible for us to link our particular benefits and contributions to insurance to our lifestyle. You just didn't know anything about your neighbor. There was no way for you to measure. There was no way for you to engage in this calculus, right? And my fear is that partly under the gentle push of Silicon Valley, and partly because there are all sorts of political and economic changes happening in Europe and in the world globally, that turn towards neoliberalism, and we can talk about more political matters if you want during the Q&A, we are experiencing this complete dissolution of the kind of old ways of thinking where it was actually possible to think about things like solidarity. And we're moving towards something where selfishness, individuality are the main benchmarks, are the main decision criteria by which we reason. So having outlined those two options with regards to data, so either Google, Facebook, and Silicon Valley giants own the data and offer us free services, or we own this data on our own and we turn it into an asset and thus make even some money. That's the promise of the second option that a lot of people don't realize, is that this is also being sold to us as a nice way to supplement our daily income, right? It's a way in which you can actually make some capital. It's like having an account in the bank that pays an interest rate. You can also think about having a data account with one of those firms whereby they find a way in which to monetize the data by having all sorts of deals with advertising companies. Every day, a few cents or a few euros trickle down to your account. That's the kind of the option that they offer. I think we must think about a third option, right, which will keep the inspiration and the intervention of the second one, namely that we should be owners of our own data, and we should not let Silicon Valley and big giant American companies claim ownership of it, but we should not also reduce it to a commodity. Right? We should not reduce data to something that is tradable in the market. We should not be treating data, knowledge, information more broadly as something that looks like, coffee or widgets or hammers or cars, right? And this is ultimately where we have to start building comparisons and alliances with other things and products which we kind of acknowledge as being very important, but we do not reduce them to the commodity status. There is a reason why in Europe we do not sell people, right? There is a reason why in a lot of European countries we do not sell organs, right? There is a reason why in a lot of countries in Europe and elsewhere we do not sell air, right? There is a reason why in this country a few years ago there was a huge referendum to oppose the privatization of water, right? There are reasons to think about various products and goods as having certain features, right, that should not be reduced to the logic of the market. And just because there are certain companies, initiatives, and industries that can make an easy living by free riding on those products does not mean that their treatment of them as commodities is just or correct. Right? Because if we leave Google and Facebook and all these companies continue with their expansion, right? In 10 years' time, they will be selling us, they will also treat air and oxygen as something that they own because they monitor it. And they will tell you that, well, they'll let you breathe for free as long as you watch an ad. I mean, that's the dystopian future that awaits us, right? Which I think we should do our best to oppose. And I'm not joking here with this air example because ultimately this is what's happening with our data. They say that yes, they own it because they monitor it and they run the infrastructure in which it runs. But to me, it's like the post office saying that, well, just because they carry our letters, and those of you who still write letters, like it doesn't mean that the content of your letter belongs to the post office or ought to be opened and analyzed by the postman while carrying the letter to you. Right? You can probably easily imagine a system under which the old post office would work on a very different model, on the same model that Google works today. And they would say, okay, you can mail your letters for free. There will not be any stamps. But in exchange for that, we'll open your letter at the post office, we'll read it, and we'll insert an ad into it. And that will subsidize the costs of mailing you the letter. And we don't do that. We don't do that because we have privacy concerns and a lot of other concerns. But Google amplifies that problem by a factor of 20 or 50 because the amount of data that they analyze, it stretches far beyond your letters. It stretches into your social life, your communication with family, friends, and now even your bed with smart mattresses and whatnot. Right? And that's the challenge that we are facing. So basically what I'm proposing is for us to start experimenting with alternative modes of not just running and owning data, but also thinking about it. And once we manage to articulate that vision, we might also start thinking about ways in which we can build a future that is extremely technologically robust, that is extremely technologically friendly, that does not deny the benefits of technology. I think in anything that I've said today, I did not for 1 minute challenge the assumption that it's actually good to be using technology. I do not want to be, commuting by a horse cart. I'd rather be commuting in a nice car or in a nice bus. And I would rather be using, you see I have my phone here, like I would rather be using a lot of those technologies, but on terms that benefit me, the citizen, who lives in a political community, and not me, the consumer who just lives in the global marketplace that knows no borders and recognizes no norms and treats everything as subject to price negotiation. Because ultimately, that's the other alternative, and that's the other future that these companies are building. So the challenge for us is to articulate and accept a vision of a future whereby we can actually start building technologies that we think will help us, that will enable us to flourish politically, economically, socially, on terms and conditions that are not predefined by Silicon Valley. So when I look at Europe today, and when I look at policymakers in Brussels and national capitals, I see despair. I mean, that's all I see. I mean, whenever they're struck with a problem like Google, them being unable to think in terms that are not economic. I mean, that's the problem that we have in Europe. The policymakers here, I mean, America is a much worse example of this. I'm not even bringing it up. But in Europe, the problem that we have is that policymakers, for some reason, have completely lost the ability to speak and talk and act in a way that recognizes that there are other dimensions to life other than economics. Right? All they want to promote is efficiency, competitiveness, innovation. Those are the only things that matter if you listen to the way in which our politicians talk. Nobody there is interested in justice or fairness or letting communities self-manage, self-run, anything like that. Dignity, all of that is completely off the table. So when you go and talk to European politicians and policymakers, both in national capitals and in Brussels, the impression that you get is that the only possible conceivable alternative that they can imagine to Google or Silicon Valley more broadly is what they did 15 or 20 years ago, perhaps it was a bit longer, I don't remember, when they come up with this idea to launch Airbus as a response to America's Boeing. That's as far as their imagination stretches. They think that the right alternative to everything that a company like Google does, what I have described to you today, is to do exactly all of that, but to do that with a European flag outside of the window, right? As if the only thing and the only bad thing amongst everything that I've described today was the fact that these companies are American, and not the fact that they engaged in certain political and socioeconomic processes that ultimately commodify our daily existence and reduce it to something that's very banal or market-driven. That's the problem, right? The problem is not the fact that they're American, even though you can clearly connect how Silicon Valley relates to the broader geopolitical and market agenda of America. You can look at all of these new trade treaties governments are signing. All of that is very important, and they do that kind of work as well. But ultimately, the problem is not just their Americanness. The problem is also the broader politics of letting these giant monopoly companies run the show in this market-driven fashion. So if Europe was really serious about providing a serious challenge and a serious alternative to what currently it's facing in Silicon Valley, it would pursue a very different option. And I think the only way in which you can actually challenge this hegemony of Silicon Valley is by a very decentralized strategy, whereby we do go and say, something like data, nobody can own it. Citizens own it, but they cannot sell it, right? It's like a lot of other things that we cannot sell. Which means that entrepreneurs, NGOs, activists, cities would be able to come and build apps, services, platforms on top of that data in a way that would satisfy their particular information needs in a much better way than Google does. Right? Just think about it for a moment. Right now, Google satisfies some of your needs. We, of course, have internalized this rhetoric of innovation, disruption, entrepreneurship, and we think that Google satisfies all of our needs, and it even predicts them, and we think that that's the best possible innovator out there in the world, and there is nothing that we want that it doesn't deliver. I think that this internalization and justification is completely wrong. I think we have no clue what it is that we are missing, and the worst part is that Google has no clue what we are missing, and they're missing either. Because ultimately, all the services that they are providing currently are driven and determined by their business model. So if they can see a quick dollar in it, they'll offer it. If they can't, they won't. If they had started something 15 years ago and it enjoys some modest success and it will be too politically problematic to kill it, they'll continue that service. But if it doesn't bring any money, they will not pour into extra money in it, right? Those of you who do academic research might have spent some time with one of Google's products called Google Scholar. Google Scholar was started 15 years ago, and if you think about it, it has a very noble mission. Its mission is to help academics do better research, right? Google Scholar hasn't added one single feature in the last 10 years since it's launched, right? And I can assure you that if you talk to any academic who uses it on a daily basis, they'll give you a list of 20 features that will immediately make it much better for anybody who uses Google Scholar. Will it ever happen? No. Why will it never happen? It makes no money for Google. It's very simple, right? It's a public good that creates a lot of good for all of us in academia and elsewhere, intellectuals. It's just not being developed. And it will never get developed unless we actually find an alternative model rather than let Google go away with what they have done. And you should imagine that it's not so easy to build a Google Scholar from scratch because the ability to run it presupposes that you can go and index all of the academic papers and books that appear every day and that have appeared previously, which means that you need to be able to go and have a lot of server power, you need to have a lot of scanners, and you need to have a lot of agreements with publishers who will allow you to go and scan their books. Right? So ultimately, we're in a position where you can only do it on a massive scale. The European Commission can do it, like I can do it as an individual, go and negotiate all of that and build that many servers. Right? So the reason why I'm giving you this example is to show you that if we actually found a way to run an alternative data infrastructure We would actually go and say, okay, fine, we'll pull all of those academic books, we'll pull all of those academic articles together, we'll pull all of the data about our travel, we'll pull all of the data about our interactions in the city with all of the new privacy provisions. Like, I'm not asking us to create a new giant alternative to the NSA, but again, with the European flag. Right? Clearly, we will need to do it in a way that leaves a lot of this data encrypted and anonymized in a way that would be very hard to go and de-anonymize you. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting a privacy nightmare here, but that aside, if we can find a way to pull all of the data together, right, we can actually start thinking about various services that we ourselves can build to satisfy our own needs on top of that data. If only I had access to all of the books and articles and everything else that resides in Google Scholar database, I could easily build an app myself tomorrow that will satisfy a particular academic search need that I have. Right? I'm not talking about owning those books, and I'm not talking about owning those papers. I'm talking about being physically able to query them with a particular search. Right? I can't do that. Right? And just like you cannot build a small bus transportation service for a particular community or for a particular town to get 10 or 15 people who travel in the same direction, to get them on the same bus as exists in Helsinki and get you where you need to go, because that data ends up in some kind of a data silos that is not controlled by you, is not controlled by the city, and is controlled by Uber or Google, and it's only thanks to Uber or Google that your city will ever be able to get the data, and only if they pay with your own taxpayers' money for the data that you yourself have generated. Right? That's the world in which we live in. Right? And I think that the only way in which we can start moving forward ideationally and intellectually and politically is to actually start conceptualizing data as a source of hidden value in today's contemporary economy. We have to understand that data is the reason why Uber is valued at $50 billion. Google is the reason why, data is the reason why Google is one of the most profitable companies in the world. So is Facebook. And that data is ours. It's not theirs, right? And it has been taken away from us in the process of some kind of appropriation that was not necessarily visible to us, but that happened nonetheless. Right? Which then opens up a lot of exciting options. And unfortunately, given where we are in Europe politically, they're only theoretically exciting, because you cannot possibly imagine anything possibly disturbing the huge monopoly that these companies have in terms of nationalization or appropriation or anything of the sort. Like, that just will not be possible, like realistically in Europe today. What might be possible, however, and I don't even think that at the national level anything is possible, at the small city level, things are possible. Cities can actually pass provisions, ordinances, they can run tenders in a specific manner that will specify what these companies can and cannot do on the city level, what kind of data they can and cannot own, what kind of data they can and cannot control, what kind of software they can run. With all of this buzz and excitement about smart cities, for example, with HP and Cisco and IBM and Microsoft rapidly moving into cities and offering their software and their services as a way to resolve all of urban problems, is there any reason why we should be surrounding ourselves with technologies and software that is proprietary and impossible to examine? I mean, do you really want to live in a world where, in a city where everything that runs your city in terms of software is as transparent as that black box that you have in your Volkswagen car? I mean, you probably don't, right? In part because there is a very direct relationship between the openness of the software, which in the case of all these giant companies is entirely closed and proprietary, and the ability to actually examine how the systems work. Right? So as we are shifting towards this new highly digital model of the smart city, we're also moving towards a world where we'll have even less and less control and less ability to actually examine how our cities and our lives actually run, because we have no idea to even control whether the numbers that we see on the screen actually generated accurately, or they just generated because the manufacturer of the software wanted to hide some defect of the software, so they tricked the numbers. I mean, that's what we are facing. right? So we're basically talking about a giant problem that's coming our way at the city level. And I think the only way in which we can resolve it is to politicize this issue on an urban level and hope that our mayors, city councilors, and whoever is closest to us as citizens actually takes the right action, right? And so, the cities to watch in the next few years or few months would be cities like Barcelona and Madrid. Barcelona, for example, has been a city where these giant technology companies had a field day. They really went and set up Smart City Expo in Barcelona. They tried to put as much sensors, as much of the smart city technology proprietary software as possible. They privatized whatever was not yet privatized of the city infrastructure. They did horrendous things in Barcelona. Now, with the election of a new mayor who happens to have a very radical agenda for the city that does not really benefit the interests of companies, they are trying to reverse a lot of those deals, and they are trying to articulate a vision of the smart city that will not default to this highly privatized, untransparent, obfuscated, uncontrollable infrastructure, right? And it's a very tough task to carry on and carry out, and we can only wish that they succeed. But the big question that even they do not yet know how to resolve is what will happen to data and what status it will have, right? And I think this is where there is still some space in which all of us can contribute. But I think I have to be probably slowly nearing the conclusion here and open up for questions. And I think the takeaway message that and I hope that all of you take from this talk is that there are a lot of stories out there that are being told by Silicon Valley, American politicians, increasingly European politicians, about the role of digital technology and the way in which it's transforming or disrupting or improving our life, right? And the way in which they present those stories, it's usually extremely apolitical. They're telling us that those things are here to stay. They're not to be challenged. They're not to be questioned. There is only one way to run a smart city. There is only one way to collect big data. There is only one way to run search. These companies have discovered it, and we should just accept and celebrate it, or otherwise we'll be swept away and swept aside by the forces of change, by the forces of disruption, by the forces of globalization. This is a very deterministic narrative that involves a lot of incorrect assumptions about how the world works, and which basically eliminates the political dimension from our existence. We have to be able to contest those stories, and we also have to be able to read them as stories, because ultimately that's what they are. Those are narratives about the apparently healthy state of contemporary capitalism that seek to convince us that if only we surrender more and more of our life, both personally in our cities, in our homes, in our families, to the control of the giant corporations, the more liberated and emancipated we will feel. Right? And I think we have to be extremely skeptical about those claims. But in the meantime, we also have to be able to articulate some kind of a counter-narrative, some kind of a counter-story that will not default to the usual narrative tropes of technophobes, of people who oppose technology because they don't like technology, right? And who would rather live in the forest surrounded by trees and not use electricity, and they would oppose modern dentistry and all of the things that modernity has brought us. This is not the right narrative with which to oppose what Silicon Valley is doing, right? We have to be able to tell the story that technology at this point is basically politics by other means. This is what it is when it comes to health, when it comes to insurance, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to organizing how we live in the city. And we have to be able to oppose these technological projects on a logic that's ultimately political and not technological. Right? We do not want to oppose sensors. We do not want to oppose big data. We do not want to oppose smart cars that can pick us up and deliver us where we need to go. But the mere appearance of those sensors, big data, algorithms, and cars does not resolve the fundamental political questions about who should own those things, how much control citizens should have over it, how much transparency do you want to have in the software that runs those systems. All of those are extremely political questions, have nothing to do with technology. And I think the great rhetorical success that Silicon Valley has had over the last 2 decades was precisely in making us forget this political dimension and reframing all of those debates as ultimately a debate about progress and modernity, and not a debate about politics and economics. And we have to be able to reinsert those political frameworks back into this debate. And that's what I've tried to do today. And I hope you have questions. Thank you.
Hi. While talking about exploitation of our data for surveillance or commercial purposes, for me the biggest and the saddest point is that what I call the matrix problem, that is like people do not care. Solution exists like there is Linux, but people prefer Apple because they think it's cool. It's cool, or it exists Firefox, but people use Chrome. Mm-hmm. So my question is, since most of the people do not care, should be a paternalistic state that take care of an uninterested population?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think what we have to understand is that what I've said in my very last remarks, that there is this tendency to present all those issues as technological and consumer-based choices rather than political choices, it's also true in this matter. I mean, we have to be able to convince people that ultimately it might not seem as important, your choice of Firefox over Chrome, or choice of iOS over Linux, but ultimately that's a very small contribution towards a future in which your healthcare, your insurance policy, and a lot of other things will ultimately be determined, right? And I know that it might seem like a very crazy argument, but that actually is true. Your inability to resist the extended power that these companies are building around your life ultimately is a factor in their ability to be powerful or not be powerful. So if we manage to trace all of those logical chains, which these technology companies actually want to break, they want to convince us that what happens in your browser is separate from what happens with your insurance policy. What happens with your smart kitchen is different from what happens with your doctor and your health. They are trying to break this holistic perspective. What we need to do is to reintroduce the holistic perspective by trying to link all those things that ultimately belong together into one narrative. And we have to be able to tell the story to people in a way that they would be able to grasp all those connections. I think that's the only way in which we can make people aware of the problem. I don't believe in the power of the paternalistic state here, but there is also a secondary issue here. And that issue has to do with the fact that, I mean, it's true that a lot of these alternative sources and platforms are underfunded. They do not get as much venture capital and any kind of capital than you can get in Silicon Valley if you're working in a commercial product that revolves around data, which of course also means that a lot of them are much harder to use than services that have 5,000 designers, picking the right background color for your page. But that again is not something irreversible. There is a lot of money at the European level that the European Commission spends on technology policy. That money does not go to Linux, and it doesn't go to any of the free software stuff. Mostly it goes to various European telecoms, and it goes to various big, giant corporations instead of going to people who challenge them. That can be reversed, and you can actually have more money, but all of those things have to be presented as ultimately political choices and political decisions. I have no idea why the European Commission prefers to fund big giant companies instead of funding these efforts. That's something that can be influenced, but to influence that, you need some public pressure from the citizens. But on top of that, I think we have to be very clear about why people use those services like Google instead of more secure ones. And it's the fact that it's just basically true that these services do offer great benefits. I mean, they are, at this point, the best assistance to a lot of overworked families and a lot of overworked parents and people who just do not have the time to take care of everything. On my phone, I use Google Now. I don't know how many of you use Google Now and know what it does. Google Now basically monitors your activity across all of Google services. And I travel a lot, I give all these talks, I'm always in motion. I just cannot keep track of all my commitments. My calendar, my travel reservations, everything. I don't have a secretary. Google does that for me. They analyze everything that goes through my mail. They put things on my calendar without me even knowing it. They check me into flights. It does it. Like for me, it saves a lot of money, right? And for people who have a busy life, it does offer a great service. And all of that is possible only because this giant company sucks all the data from me and delivers that service. And I mean, I'm sorry, these companies are the new welfare state. Like, that's what you would expect from a state that was actually working in your favor. It will give you time. It will give you time to do things. How do you get free time now? You delegate things to technology. And mostly now you delegate it passively in a way that these technologies can monitor you and then find you free time out of thin air because they can understand that that email comes from your airline and they can automatically check you in and they can automatically add it to your calendar. Boom, you gain 10 minutes. I mean, it's not trivial. And this is why I think, the left in Europe, which traditionally occupied itself with those questions, how do you generate free time for workers? Well, you have trade unions, you have political parties who are trying to find this free time out of thin air by limiting working hours, by limiting, the kinds of responsibilities shifted onto workers. The left doesn't do it anymore. Silicon Valley does it, which is very sad, but it does it nonetheless. And I think that any critique that we would like to advance against it has to be cognizant of that fact. We're not being sold on fake goods. We're not being sold trivial stuff here. Like, I know, I use this stuff. Like, it's not trivial, it helps. And this is the problem, that you can only outsmart these people with an actual offer of something that works better and that has a different political logic, but nonetheless it works. And you can only build that if you actually have resources behind you, which means that you can build it even on a city level. Like, you need a big, giant regional bloc. You can't build it on a national level. You need a big, giant national bloc of countries coming together and doing that. Europe is not going to do that. Countries like Latin America might do that. You might think of some crazy alliance between China, Russia, Latin America. I mean, it will have all sorts of privacy implications and surveillance implications that might be even worse than Silicon Valley. But those are the kinds of blocs that can take it on. So, but that will also tell you what I think about, hacktivists and makers and all these small decentralized movements that are trying to present some challenge to this rhetoric of Silicon Valley, which for me operates at a scale that is so small that ultimately they don't have the teeth to do much damage. Yes. Maybe I'll take a few questions at once because my answers tend to be very long.
Okay, I want to ask if, for the moment, there is some other company or better startup, some in Europe or other in South Africa, that develop some software that are alternative to what the United States create, like, I don't know, Selfish OS or Ubuntu OS, especially for the smartphone. Mm-hmm. And they say that they don't sell data. But don't you think that this can be really an alternative? And if it is, how it's possible to take more diffusion, I don't know how to say, sorry, it's not very good in English. It's, I don't know.
Io capisco italiano, se tu vuoi.
Okay.
Puoi...
No, how can we be sure if this company don't sell our data? That's the point, if they say that they don't sell.
Well, the bad thing is that we can't. I mean, ultimately now, I didn't talk about this dichotomy, but you also have this dichotomy. And the dichotomy is that, on the one hand, there are companies that seek to turn privacy into a luxurious good. So, you can go and pay 10 euros a month or 20 euros a month, and you'll be as private as you want. They will make sure that you don't appear on Google search. They will make sure that your email is secure, your phone is secure, everything that you do is secure. That for me is kind of a horrible option, but it's an option nonetheless, which appeals to a lot of people, which will probably make the lives of the poor, who will suffer the most from the lack of privacy, the worst, because then they'll be discriminated against in all sorts of ways by banks and all sorts of other institutions who can now peer into their life in a way that's much more extensive. And the problem is that when you give people a choice, we give you a fantastic service that is free. We just will take your data to pay for it. Or we give you a service which is less good, but you pay for it. Who's crazy enough to pay for it? I mean, most people will say, fine, give me free. I mean, that's why Google wins all the time, because Google gives you an email that's much better than anything on the market, whether you pay for it or not. And this is the point at which ultimately what should happen, again, is a state region-led effort to build a better alternative, because that's the only way. I mean, to build the infrastructure, which is what I've mentioned, was trying to think of data as a common on which you can start building other apps. That's the only way to go, because otherwise you will end up in a field where Google will always outperform you. So I mean, there are plenty of small initiatives now in Germany, for example. I mean, also in France. I mean, in France and Germany, you have this discourse of technological sovereignty, which and it's very bizarre, in Germany and France, because on most issues they have, like, what sovereignty do they have? I mean, they are very pro-American regardless. I mean, they don't really have much sovereignty left anyhow. But on technology, they have lots of sovereignty. And like, to me, it's a very bizarre proposition. And what it means by that is that, well, we'll just replace American companies with German and French ones. That's their version of technological sovereignty. So we'll remain completely dependent on America when it comes to trade policy, intellectual property policy, and everything else, military policy. But on technology, we'll be independent. Like, that means nothing, right? And that means nothing because, again, you need to go beyond just offering this tiny services like email in a secure manner to a bunch of corporate clients and then claiming that, well, we have a country with fantastic technological sovereignty while Google runs the email of its government. I mean, what technological sovereignty can you possibly imagine? So I'm afraid I don't really have a very good list of initiatives. I mean, you can go and look up what's happening in Germany. They have lots of initiatives when it comes to encrypted mail. It's just that I think even they misunderstand what's happening. I mean, look, my vision for the future of search, for example, in 5 years, we won't be doing any searches. We'll be doing very few searches, let's put it that way. Most of the information you need will be finding you on its own. Your phone will be telling you that, look, this is the information you need right now. I'm in Turin, I'm near an art gallery. Google already tells me you have to go to the gallery and see these particular pictures. Or there is this cafe, you have to go to that cafe because it has some historical relevance, because it appears in this book. It's already there, it finds me. I don't even need to go and search for Turin things to see, right? It's happening. This is what Google calls autonomous search. And it's search that is determined by context. And right now, this context is geolocational and geographic, but this context can also be much broader, social. I'm with particular people who are standing near me. Maybe I want to know something about you, so data finds me about that. Or, it's a particular time of the day, 12 o'clock, when I usually read the New York Times. Boom, articles arrive. I mean, this is the future. And the only reason why this kind of model is possible is because these companies integrate all this data about us, right? And they have aggregated so much of it. So anybody in Europe who thinks that you can take on Google with a better algorithm is insane. Because it's not an algorithm that makes Google work so well. It's the fact that they're sitting on so much data. This is what people don't understand. I can go and spend my entire life in a garage building a better algorithm. It will not help me a single bit to deliver this autonomous search service that I've just mentioned. Because there is no search. It's all derived from my data. And this is why Google has such an easy time in Europe, because all of the European policymakers are convinced that Google operates in a competitive market because anybody can invent a better algorithm. That's the most insane position I've heard in Europe. Well, sorry, no, it's not the most insane position I've heard in Europe.
Posso parlare in italiano, quindi? Ok.
Prego.
La mia domanda è questa. All'interno di un'economia capitalista il fine di un'azienda è fare profitto, no? Però all'interno di una democrazia il fine di un politico in generale è ottenere il potere per poterlo usare poi. Quindi mi chiedo come possiamo essere sicuri che il fatto di far passare il controllo di questi nostri dati da un'azienda privata a un ente pubblico migliori effettivamente la condizione. Non so, forse la cosa ha una radice più profonda, perché è come se stessimo dando una grossa fetta della nostra vita privata e la stessimo dando come pubblica, cioè pensiamo all'utilizzo di Facebook, no? Quindi forse questa questione della privacy da proteggere finisce prima dell'utilizzo di questi mezzi. È questo quello che mi chiedo io.
Sì, sì, ok. La mia fidanzata è italiana, quindi posso fare l'intero intervento in italiano, però preferisco inglese. So, I mean, the question about data protection and the way in which the public can regulate the activities of this company is very good. But again, I don't think that Europe has actually understood what the challenge facing it is. The data protection legislation that we have in Europe does not account for a lot of technological changes that have happened in the last few years. It does not account for algorithms, for example. So if you look at the recent law that has been passed in France, surveillance law, the French Constitutional Court has found it completely constitutional, even though they have a metadata analysis system that is probably as extensive as that of the NSA, because they can actually analyze data on the fly with algorithms, and they can identify and predict whether you are a terrorist or not based on the real-time analysis of the data, which they don't even need to store, which has nothing to do with storage, right? Which means that a lot of data protection legislation is completely outside of the picture, right? So in Europe, I don't actually believe in the ability of regulators to do much in order to rein in and tie the hands of private companies. So, you know, I wish I could tell you that we can rely on the old kind of European social model where we let the market do what it does best, and then we'll step in and we'll just regulate it with better rules and regulations. I'm afraid that that just will not be possible, in part because our own frameworks are inadequate, and in part because our own governments at this point are as interested in surveillance as the American one. That's something that is not obvious to a lot of people in Europe who get caught up in all this media coverage of the recent decisions by the European Court of Justice. But if you look at, again, at some of the recent laws that have been passed in France, in England, in Austria, in Spain, they are all very heavy on surveillance. They are more than happy to go and peer into what you do. I mean, so my prediction for the future of policy in Europe is rather grim. I don't think that you can actually trust the governments. The governments are not your allies at this point. So, which is, you know, I'm more than happy to think about new methods and mechanisms of using encryption and of using, you know, other mechanisms of keeping the data private. I just have very little faith in law. Not because I'm kind of, you know, legal nihilist or anything of the sort. It's just that right now in Europe, the political and legal climate does not favor legal solutions. So, unfortunately. Yes? Anybody else?
Okay, so this is just two questions. I'm not European, so I actually don't know if Europe is powerful or not, but you mentioned that there is also an economic part, that they are actually running out of money, so it's convenient for them to outsource these problems out of economical reasons. So I wanted you to explore a little bit of that and in the economic aspect. And also, I'm curious, like, is anyone with a power who believes your story?
Well, I mean, the people with power who believe my story happen to be people who are worried about the same kind of issues that I'm worried about, which in this case are very easy to name. It's a very old-fashioned word, but you know, it's imperialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, and so on. So they happen to be people who are on the kind of real left and not the fake left that we have in Europe. So, I mean, they happen at this point to be a lot of them in Latin America. I mean, you can talk to a lot of people in Spain, Greece, and, you know, who get the message. Because ultimately, it's not a story about technology, right? And this is what a lot of people don't understand. They think that, you know, I'm mounting here some kind of attack on modernity, and I'm bringing in some romantic, you know, tales from some Black Forest in Germany, and I just want everybody live like Heidegger in a hut. I mean, like, I don't want anything like that, right? So there are people who can go and talk to a lot of governments and forces that are trying to lead other efforts to regain sovereignty, because technological sovereignty is just a subset of much broader struggles for sovereignty more general. You have a lot of countries now fighting for food sovereignty. Have a lot of governments now fighting for energy sovereignty, financial sovereignty, both from Wall Street, but also from the agencies that do the ratings. And the problem that you would know very well in Italy, where ratings do determine the rating of your debt. And that then determines the state of your financial markets and a lot of other things. Why should three unelected American agencies determine your credibility, the credibility of your debt, right? I mean, there are a lot of very good struggles happening right now, and the struggle for technological sovereignty has to be reinserted into that broader struggle globally. With regards to the question of money in Europe, I mean, here the story, I think, is very simple. It's well, I mean, Europe has found itself in a crisis, a deep political and economic crisis that I don't think is short-term. It's a crisis that began probably in the 70s and did not begin in 2007. What we saw in 2007 was just an expression of it. The truth is that the lifestyle that Europe has had since the Second World War is no longer sustainable. But it's not sustainable because all of us have become lazy and don't want to work. I mean, all of that happened for various political decisions, and I would link it to the rise of certain political and economic ideologies, the privatization that has happened. I mean, I can give you a 10-hour lecture about what has happened since 1970s. But ultimately, we end up in a situation where politicians have to fake some activity, so they fake reforms. And they fake reforms by surrounding themselves with cool-sounding technologies and apps, which deliver some results. It's just that those results are kind of, in the long run, useless. In some sense, it's not exactly the same story, but in America, and also in Europe, in many countries, how did we solve the housing problem 8 or 9 years ago? Well, we gave cheap housing loans to everybody, which then eventually caused the housing crisis and the collapse of the mortgage bonds, and everything kind of collapsed because we were settling on a short-term solution to a problem that required very different set of interventions. And we're doing the same with technology. We are now trying to create this fake kind of patches on problems that cannot be patched so easily because they require political and economic solutions, and ultimately those patches will rip off. That's the sad story, and unfortunately the amount of linguistic and intellectual confusion that surrounds technology at this point is probably greater than the intellectual confusion surrounding Eurobonds and quantitative easing in Europe. So people just have no clue, and they think that because we're using those technologies on a daily basis, and we tend to view them favorably because, as I've said, they do offer a real benefit to a lot of us because they save us time. We tend not to have any critical dimension to our thinking about it, so we just accept them as presents from God, that God being Steve Jobs, and we use them. So yeah, it's a sad story.
Hi. Well, now that the system isn't so physically present around us, the Google system and so on, because also Italy is more analogic than America, for example. Can we boycott or trick the system using the system itself? So I mean, for example, using ad block that made the data that Google collect useless because the ad doesn't show, so the ad doesn't pay Google, or using faking surveys and so on. For example, I use Google Rewards that sometimes gives me surveys and gives me money when I complete it. I always troll it, and I gain a lot of money trolling Google Rewards. Or I use Google Now. I read the title, and I signals as I don't mind what I really mind. So, for example, I try to fake my profile using my profile. Yes, so yes. I use the system, but the system doesn't recognize me as a real person.
No. It's actually I get that question a lot. And, there is an entire practice. There is an entire term for that. A lot of people call it Google jamming. It's kind of trying to jam the system by exhibiting various fake or various kind of destructive behavior. I mean, look. Ultimately, it has great art value. Like you can be a great artist. Like that's what Marcel Duchamp will be doing today if if he was alive. That said, beyond art value, like I just don't. Sorry, like it was a very big compliment to you. I know you can put it on the back of your book eventually. But it just doesn't. It just doesn't cause as much damage to the system as we imagine. But also, for me, it kind of perpetuates this individualistic approach to politics, where the only possible thing we can do to fight the system is to come up with some kind of individualistic solution, being a hacker of the system. And this is where I think this paradigm of the hacker and the figure of the hacker itself is very closely aligned with the neoliberal paradigm of the entrepreneur, because both operate in rather individualistic terms, trying to change the system on their own rather than collectively. I mean, ultimately, where does this logic lead? So, there are people now who are trying to fight video cameras that pop up all over our cities and have facial recognition capabilities in them by wearing masks. So yes, in Japan, you can now buy a mask that will kind of make you impossible to capture on a facial recognition camera. Like, I don't want to live in a world where I have to wear a mask when I go out in the city. But like, yes, it jams the system. Right? So in that sense, there is always a border as to where art starts and politics begins. And I have no problem with some of the minor things like that. And the graceful acts are very good. And basically, the logic is correct. The logic is correct in the sense that you can only transform a system if you start operating within it, in some sense. So, there is no other outside. You have to start from existing. Like, I use Gmail to write articles that are very critical of Google. Like, I know that it might look hypocritical, but I actually think that, like, I've done my moral calculus, and I think that at this point in time, this is the right thing to do. Like, so I'm not arguing for any kind of moral, ethical purity, and we have to be using the best infrastructure that's out there while we work. But we shouldn't just... that shouldn't give us also the grounds not to analyze that infrastructure. And this is sorry, I'm digressing here a little bit, but if you look at some of the promising political movements that have emerged now in Europe, if you look at Podemos in Spain, these people are all over social media. They love Facebook, they love Twitter, right? And why do they love? And they're like a proper leftist party that's not really that fake as the rest of the left in Europe. And you look at them and you ask them, so guys, what's your position on Facebook or Google? And they say, oh, but they're great. They help us to bypass the hegemony of the mainstream media. Mainstream media doesn't want to cover us, so we go to Facebook and we get all the coverage that we want. In the short term, fantastic strategy, go for it. In the long term, it's like you have no analysis of the transformation of labor, work, production, consumption, anything that involves those platforms. You have just a giant analytical black hole because you're so dependent on this infrastructure to avoid the mainstream media, which for me means that you have no understanding of what's happening to the economy and what will happen in the next 5 years. Short term, great perspective. Long term, you're analytically dead. Right? So, trade-off.
Yeah, hi. I don't know if this could make any sense, but the point is, I think that nowadays, like, a lot of European policymakers are old, like, they reason in a very old fashion. So they probably view all of these technologies like only in an economic sense. So what I want to ask is, could this like fix itself when digital natives change the policymaker generations, when digital natives become the policymaker generation?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. In the abstract, I think there is some truth to it, and some of these politicians are clearly old. But, you can also look at the older generation, before me and you were born, if you look at the older generation of European statesmen, in France, in Germany, you look at de Gaulle or Willy Brandt, or, Italy is a complicated case, but, if you look at many of them, you'll see that they actually had some backbone. They could actually stand up and defend European interests, even against the American interests. You could actually see them making points that went beyond just the rhetoric of innovation and efficiency and, and reforms, right? There was actually some substance to what they were saying. Looking at the digital natives surrounding us today in politics, I just sorry, like I wouldn't go further into the details, but I don't see that substance. Right? That said, there is also a massive effort now by the likes of Silicon Valley and Google and Facebook to capture the young generation. I mean, to me, it's just undeniable. All the schools teaching people how to code in the abstract sense, fantastic. If you start analyzing the details, there is a certain political agenda there that, again, tries to reframe all social and political problems as individualistic problems to be solved by individual hackers rather than collectively as part of a larger group, city, urban collective, or what have you. There is so much propaganda and brainwashing that's happening, targeting the young people. And these companies are much more than companies. I mean, they have their own think tanks now. Google runs something called Google Ideas, which is an actual think tank inside a company that goes and organizes events and conferences for the young people, brings people across borders together. There is an ideological project also. And I just don't think that the digital natives are as unideological or political as they are. I mean, and ultimately, it's not just a question of competence. Everything I've said today try to highlight the great political ideological dimension to this project. Right? And to me, it's not just a matter of expertise. I mean, you can know anything that you want to know about sensors and big data, and still you wouldn't know who should own the data, the companies or the citizens. Right? It's a question of very old-fashioned political ideology. We had those debates about ownership of land and labor and cities for centuries. It's not something that young people can just resolve by being young. So in that sense, it would be nice to have more younger people around, but I'm sorry to sound like this very conservative person, but I don't trust young people all that much when it comes to actually being radical. Europe is no longer radical, and younger Europe is no longer radical as well, I'm afraid to say.
Ok, I think... Vuoi fare una domanda?
Maybe some radical European will now throw a tomato at me.
No more questions. No, sto scherzando.
Hi. I've been studying sociology and new media at university, so I've been facing these debates and problems, and I've always found myself more apocalyptic than integrate. So I understand.
More? What? Sorry, I didn't hear.
In terms of apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic, great. That's my feeling.
Okay. I don't know if you like this kind of definitions, but it's the way I am approaching it.
We're on the same page.
So, it was just like in a philosophical sense, because in a practical way, I found myself working for Google as a page quality rater. And that's something I really, really hated, because I found myself tracked, and everything I do, even if I open an email, they know what I do. And so I really found out that I want to fight this same thing I'm doing. And the thing I want to ask you is, do you think it's better to log off every kind of technology, or maybe I can start hacking myself in some ways, because I can do this, but I would like to start it. Or do you think
project?
that?
Sorry, and I don't want to just your use of those services, or there is some bigger project that
I don't know if you know Lionbridge.
Which?
Lionbridge.
Lionbridge.
Yeah, it's an American company which works with Google, and you need to just evaluate some pages, some web pages that Google proposes you, and you have to study like a manual. They have some rules you have to follow, and so. Yeah, I'm working for Lionbridge, which works with Google, Yeah,
I mean, look, I can't, I'm not the church. I can't, tell you what to do.
I'm on the dark side.
But, I mean, I can only answer that in very broad strokes. And the broad strokes answer is that people ask me similar questions a lot when it comes to their personal use of technology. And they ask me, should I just log off? Should I just get off Facebook? Should I just throw away my mobile phone? And the answer is, I mean, if you're brave enough, go ahead. But I just don't think that that should be our demand on citizens, because I just don't think that it's structurally possible for people now, if they want to look normal, not to use Facebook or not to have a mobile phone. It's just impossible to integrate into modern society and get a job or rent an apartment if you don't have those things, let alone use Airbnb or anything else that you need to use. It's just that's the sad reality. Like, you can try to think of ways in which you can move as much of your activity away from Google as possible if you're willing to forego use of all those tools like Google Now and everything else. I don't think that as a, as a philosopher, intellectual, whatever, I want to impose that demand on you, right? Because I just don't, it's like telling people, well, don't take on a mortgage, because if you take on a mortgage, your bank will have to analyze your data to understand your credit score. Like, yes, don't take on a mortgage and then live under the bridge. Like, I'm not going to make that kind of, pitch to young people. But that said, I also think that we have to, and again, that's what I try to do today, to present Silicon Valley, Google, Facebook, and all those companies as part of a much bigger political project that itself needs to be opposed. And you cannot fight that project with these tiny actions like logging off. Like, we're not going to have a fair trade alternative to Google. We can just go and use email with the fair trade sign on it and feel good about yourself. Like, that's not an option. Not that it was an option with coffee or any other product that really made much of a difference. So, like, it's good to think about your individual technology use on a daily basis, but it's also good to think about these things more politically, more holistically, on a much bigger macro scale, and not to get too hung up on your individual daily choices, because otherwise you'll be thinking more about whether to log off or not, rather than thinking what role does Google perform today in the geopolitical analysis of American politics or Eurozone or whatever. Like, I'd rather you think about those matters than to spend more and more time about your own personal technologies. Okay. Thank you.